Romeo awoke from stasis with a jolt, his mind still half immersed in the dream of fierce battle against the green dragon. The VM feeds retracted and he flexed his limbs, reorienting himself to the waking world aboard the Starship Madison. He made his way to the control room, scanning screens and readouts for any sign of trouble that could explain his untimely awakening. All systems were nominal, no hull breaches, power failures, or anomalous readings. The 5 habitat stations showed all crew safely in stasis. It was puzzling. Idly fingering the ruby heart charm on his dog tags, a gift from his beloved back on Earth, Romeo pondered what could have triggered his pod to bring him out of stasis. Perhaps a glitch in the VM programming? He pulled up the maintenance schedule, seeing a routine systems check was nearly due anyway. Might as well get it over with. For the next 4 hours, Romeo methodically worked his way through the ship's corridors, testing power nodes and feed lines to the stasis pods. Everything checked out until he reached the section housing the biostasis crew. Passing the pod of Tatsuo Takahashi, he spotted something odd, the glint of an enameled green dragon charm peeking out from under the Asian man's dog tags. Understanding dawned on Romeo and he allowed himself a wry smile. Digging into the VEM code, his suspicions were confirmed. Takahashi had hacked his own alarm clock, so he could periodically emerge and spend time in the Dragon Dance virtual environment. The man was obsessed. Shaking his head, Romeo reset the code, put the ship back in hibernation mode, and returned himself to blissful, dreamless stasis. But across the vast reaches of space and time, in another reality, the saga continued. In a smoldering cave beneath a flame-scarred mountain, a red dragon stirred to wakefulness with an earth-shaking roar. Meizxala the Crimson uncurled her sinuous length and stretched luxuriously, talons gouging the basalt. She sniffed the sulphurous air, tongue flicking out to taste the currents. No scent of enemies or rivals, but a familiar musk tinged the breeze. Her mate Shiruzak was near. Perhaps the blue had returned early from his hunting foray. Meizxala made her way to the cave entrance and launched herself into the cloudless azure sky with a mighty sweep of her wings. She climbed in a swift spiral, scanning the valley far below. No sign of Shiruzak's cobalt form. Banking into a thermal, she rose higher still until the curve of the planet was visible, continents and seas laid out like a living map. A glint of light in the far distance caught her eye, sunlight reflecting off something metallic, something that didn't belong. Meizxala's eyes narrowed and a low growl rumbled in her throat. She angled her wings and surged forward, determined to investigate the anomaly. As she neared, the shape resolved into something utterly alien, a massive structure of metal and glass, clearly not of this world. The dragon back-winged to an abrupt halt, hovering in place as she took in the unsettling sight. The structure was long and cylindrical, studded with domes that reminded Meizxala of a hornet's nest. Her sharp vision could make out movement behind the dome's crystalline panes, figures moving about inside. Baring her fangs, she stealthily glided closer. Peering into the nearest dome, Meizxala saw bizarre creatures, bilaterally symmetrical with no wings, scales, or proper tails. They milled about like so many termites, tapping on glowing panels and speaking to each other in a grating tongue. What manner of beasts were these interlopers? The dragon considered her next move. To immediately incinerate the structure and its inhabitants would be simplest. But curiosity stayed her impulse. More reconnaissance was needed before deciding on a course of action. Meizxala slipped silently away, determined to consult with Shiruzak upon his return. This required careful thought. Back aboard the Madison, Tatsuo Takahashi woke from his own abbreviated stasis, a mischievous glint in his eye. It had been far too long since he'd had a proper dragon dance. Quickly shutting down his pod, he made his way to the VM interface station, fingers flying over the controls as he lost himself in the familiar ritual of configuring his private virtual playground. Soon, the simulated vista of Dragon Valley shimmered into existence around him. Tatsuo stretched luxuriously, feeling the sensation of his powerful scaled body, the flex of wing sails and lashing of spiked tail. This was freedom, this was life. He launched himself into the air with a roar of pure exultation. Shaking out his emerald wings, Tatsuo soared over valleys and peaks rendered in meticulous detail by the VM. The Madison's quantum AI had built this world from his memories, an amalgam of fantasy and a childhood spent exploring the rugged wilderness of Hokkaido. Every stone, every tree, carried the vivid clarity of that distant past brought to life. For a time, Tatsuo simply reveled in the primal joy of flight, chasing clouds and riding thermals ever higher into the achingly blue sky. Then a flash of crimson scales in the distance below caught his eye. Another dragon, flying in tight circles over a particular spot. Tatsuo frowned. The VM hadn't rendered any other dragons in a long time, not since he defeated the Citron in that final epic battle. Unless a chill ran down his serpentine spine. Could it be her? The rumors spoke of a living myth, a dragon without peer, ancient when the world was young. Very few had seen the Red Queen and none had challenged her and lived. There was no mistaking that blood ruby hide, the scythe-like talons, the regal tilt of her horns. Meizxala the crimson in the scaled flesh. Tatsuo's first impulse was to flee, but as he watched the red dragon wheel and dart with quicksilver grace, he found himself enraptured. Surely the queen hadn't detected his presence yet. Could he dare get closer, just a little, to marvel at this living legend? The opportunity was too tempting to resist. Gliding silently on an updraft, Tatsuo maneuvered himself into a sheltered cleft where he could observe Meizxala unseen. Now that he was closer, he could see she wasn't simply flying aimlessly, but seemed to be searching for something, her wedge-shaped head swiveling alertly. Following her line of sight, Tatsuo gasped in shock. There, nestled incongruously among the crags, was an unmistakable structure he knew all too well, a habitat dome of the Madison. What was a piece of the ship doing rendered here in Dragon Valley? Had his VM hacking somehow corrupted the simulation? Or was there more to this than met the eye? As Tatsuo watched in growing horror, Meizxala swooped down upon the dome, landing beside it with enough force to make the mountain tremble. She crouched before the structure's curving wall of crystal, cocking her head in an oddly bird-like gesture of curiosity. Then she reared up, forelegs braced against the dome, and peered inside intently. Suddenly, with a roar like a rockslide, Meizxala whirled away from the dome. Eyes blazing like coals, jaws agape, the Red Queen sprang into the air, fury emanating from every straining pinion as she slashed at the sky. Tatsuo's heart pounded as she sped straight toward his hiding place, certain he'd been spotted. He tensed, preparing to leap into flight. But Meizxala didn't attack. She barreled past Tatsuo's position, scorching the air with the heat of her passage, and seconds later had disappeared behind a granite spire. Tatsuo sagged with relief, only to stiffen again as a thought struck him. Where was she going in such a hurry, and what had she seen in the dome? Propelled by insatiable curiosity, Tatsuo left the safety of the cleft and glided over to the dome with utmost stealth. He alit on its curved surface, talons gripping the alloy flawlessly machined to resist vacuum. Catching his reflection, he noted his scales had taken on the muted olive drab of a biostasis crew uniform, an interesting detail. Rows of viewports ringed the dome's sides and Tatsuo shielded the glare with a foreclaw to peer inside. What he saw made even a dragon's blood run cold. Ranks of tanks, cylindrical vats large enough to hold a human, filled the space within the dome. And suspended in those fluid-filled coffins, he saw the faces of his crewmates, eyes closed as if in death. The Madison didn't have external domes, and this certainly wasn't a part of any official ship schematics he knew of. Pulse pounding, Tatsuo tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this some dark secret the biostasis crew wasn't meant to know? Experiments being conducted on unwitting volunteers? He had to find out more. But as Tatsuo craned his neck for a better view, his horns knocked against the alloy with a resounding clang. He froze, certain the noise would bring Meizxala swooping back to investigate. He couldn't let himself be captured, or worse. Not now, when he'd stumbled upon something so dire. He had to get back to his pod and find a way to alert the rest of the crew. Launching into the air, wingtips shearing, Tatsuo sped toward the entry point he used to secretly access his dragon dance sessions. But as he neared the shimmering portal, the world flickered around him. Vam construct destabilizing into pixelated chaos before snapping back into focus. Tatsuo barely had time to register the aberration before the dome was rushing up to meet him, its curve now an onrushing wall. He woke with a strangled gasp, flailing against the confines of his stasis pod. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was back in the tanks of that nightmare dome, submerged and helpless. But gradually, the familiar confines of the pod resolved around him, biofeeds still attached to his flesh. Just a dream. It had all been just another dragon dance. Not just a dream. As full consciousness returned, Tatsuo knew with grim certainty that what he'd experienced was more than a VEM fantasy gone wrong. Call it a premonition, call it a glitch in the Matrix, but he knew. He'd been granted a glimpse behind the curtain, and now it was up to him to find out the truth, even if he had to wake the entire crew to do it. But Tatsuo had barely begun to fumble for the pod release when the VM feeds released and the hatch opened of its own accord. Blinking in the sudden light, he found himself face to face with Romeo Anders, the Madison's biostasis commander. The older man did not look happy. "Takahashi, we need to talk." Romeo's voice was stern. "Did you really think you could keep hacking the VEM without consequences? This ends now." Tatsuo gaped at him, still shaken by his experience in the dragon dance. If Romeo only knew. But no, this wasn't the time. He had to play it cool, find out how much the commander had discovered on his own. I don't know what you're talking about," he managed, feigning innocence. "I was just in stasis, same as everyone else." Romeo crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Don't insult my intelligence, crewman. I traced the unauthorized access. You've been spending a lot of time in unauthorized sims. Dragon Valley ring any bells?" Tatsuo felt the blood drain from his face. If Romeo had seen what was in that valley, what Meizxala had discovered, the commander was studying him intently, brow furrowed. "Is there something you need to tell me, Takahashi?" Romeo's voice gentled, but lost none of its steel. "If you saw anything unusual during your little jaunts." "No, sir," Tatsuo interrupted, deciding to bluff it out. "Just reliving some childhood memories. You know how it is, stuck in the tin can for months on end. A guy needs some fresh air now and then, even if it's only virtual." It was a gamble, but Tatsuo knew he needed to buy time. Time to investigate on his own, gather proof before accusing respected officers of dark deeds. The biostasis team was a close-knit bunch, and wild allegations without evidence would only make him look unhinged. Romeo held his gaze a moment longer, searching. Then he sighed. "Fine. I'll let it slide this time. But no more unauthorized access, understood? Next time you feel the need for a scenic detour, you come to me first." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." Tatsuo ducked his head to hide the relief threatening to crack his mask of contrition. "It won't happen again. See that it doesn't." Romeo turned to go, then paused. "And Takahashi? If there's ever anything you need to talk about, my door is always open. Remember that." With that, the commander strode off down the corridor, leaving Tatsuo alone with his racing thoughts. He stared after the man's retreating form, already beginning to plot his next move. One thing was certain now: he had to get back into Dragon Valley and find out the truth behind that dome, before it was too late. Meanwhile, half a universe away, Meizxala the Red Queen had returned to her den to brood over what she'd witnessed in her territory. The strange structure with its terrible purpose could only mean one thing: invaders had come to Dragon Valley, with designs on its secrets and treasures. This would not stand. The Crimson Dragon began to scheme, summoning ancient sorceries not unleashed in eons. When the interlopers returned, as they surely would, she would be ready for them. Let them send their metal beasts and armored thralls. Dragon fire would test their mettle, and the green would burn brightest of all, to light her way to victory. Thus the battle lines were drawn, and the players assembled for a contest that would shake the very heavens. Meizxala the Crimson in her mountain fastness, drawing on the primordial might of tooth and claw. Tatsuo Takahashi, the rebel in the ranks who'd stumbled onto a hidden truth. and Romeo Anders, a good soldier trying to hold it all together, unaware of the forces about to engulf him. 3 lives, 3 fates, on a collision course at the crossroads of dream and reality. In the game of dragons, only one would emerge unscathed. The first move had been made. Game on.